Welcome back everyone. For today's video we are going to be taking a look at the second round of the European Team Chess Championship being held in Budva, Montenegro. Now yesterday some of the favorites were actually upset. Azerbaijan, for example, lost to Denmark. Norway had a tough start, but Magnus Carlsen did win. And today Norway is playing against Austria, and of course we are going to cover the game that Magnus played. So let's jump right into the action. So today we have the player Valentin Dragnev from Austria, rated 2589, playing against Magnus Carlsen, of course the former 5-time world chess champion. So Dragnev starts with the move e4. We get the move c5 from Magnus. Obviously Magnus playing another very low rated player relative to his rating. Now in Doha he did not do so well against the lower rated Indian players, but today could be different. So we get e4 c5, knight f3. Magnus plays the move knight c6. We get the move bishop to b5 being played here. Dragnev decides to play the classic Rossolimo instead of going into the open Sicilian with the move 3d4. So we get bishop b5, and now Magnus plays the move e6. Now Magnus has played many moves here. He's played e6. He's also played this move e5. He's obviously played g6 as well, and I think he's even played knight f6. So with all these different moves, Magnus decides today to go for the e6 setup. We get the move castles, and now we have the move knight g to e7. After knight g7 we get the move rook to e1 being played here. Now knight g7 an important move here because black can go knight g6. He guards the knight on c6, but he can also play for d5 as well. So after white plays rook e1, Magnus goes for knight d4, and the reason behind this move is that he's very worried about a big white center. If black were to play a move like g6, for example, white can go c3, and after bishop g7 and d4, let's just say black trades and goes d5 here. After white plays a move like e5 with knight c3 and bishop g5, white is much better here simply because black is this terrible dark square bishop that is hemmed in by the central pawns and has no scope whatsoever. So Magnus plays the move knight d4. We get knight takes knight, pawn takes, and now Dragnev plays the move c3 here. Now the reason behind c3 is that Magnus is trying to stop white from getting the big white center, but when you play c3 you offer the trade of the pawns, and if black were to take after knight takes c3, your next move will be d4 to build the big white center. So Magnus plays a6 here, a logical move. A to kick the bishop away from b5, but b when the bishop retreats to f1. Now you can always play d5 or d6 because the pawn is no longer pinned. So we get knight to c6 here from Magnus. Obviously, as I said before, does not want to trade on c3 and give white the big center. So we get knight c6. We get this move b4 being played here. Now all this is pretty standard theory. Of course, chess theory has developed a lot over the last decade or so specifically, and both players are in prep, which is definitely a bad sign for Magnus Carlsen because Magnus is very clearly a better player, but when you get to play the opening really quickly without having to think it, you get to play like a 3500 rated stockfish, life is always easier. So we get b4 here, and the reason behind this move is that white might want to go a4 and b5 to harass the knight on c6. Also here, it's very hard to activate the bishop on this diagonal. You could play d3. It is a move here, but after bishop c5, black is generally a little bit better. So we get b4, and Magnus plays bishop to e7. Dragnev plays a4, taking space, intending to potentially play b5, and now we get castles from Magnus, and Dragnev plays knight a3 instantly. Now the reason behind knight a3 here is that if you play b5 right away after pawn takes pawn, you cannot capture with the pawn because spaghetti-o, you hang the rook on a1. So when you play knight a3, you can play b5 now. If black plays h6 after b5 takes, nothing is happening on the a file. Additionally here, if black were to play h6, you can even play a move like knight to c2, forcing black to decide what he's doing in the center of the board. So Magnus decides here to trade on c3 because now white can no longer build a big white center with d4. That being said, white has a very nice position with the pawns on these three squares. White can go for knight c4, bishop e3, and knight b6 if he has time. So Magnus goes bishop f6, Dragnev plays bishop b2, and now we get the move d6. On first glance, you might think, well, wait, black can take a pawn. Pawn takes knight, bishop takes bishop. Let's do the count. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 extra pawn, and black should win. But if you play knight takes b4, white can play the in-between move pawn to e5 here. Rook guards the pawn, you attack the bishop, bishop goes back, you lose the knight and you lose the game. So Magnus plays d6 first here to stop e5. We get queen b3, and now we have queen c7, and Dragnev plays rook a d1. Now both players have, relatively speaking, completed their development. Dragnev has finished all of his queenside development. Magnus still has some slight issues with the bishop on c8 and the rook on a8, and additionally white is going after his pawn on d6 very quickly. So Magnus plays rook to d8, we get knight to c4, and now Magnus plays b6, trying to fianchetto the bishop to b7. After b6, we get knight to e3 from Dragnev. Magnus plays bishop b7, and now we have this move knight to g4 being played here. And the reason behind this move is that white really would love to play a move like c4. Say you could get this position. Bishop has this great nice long diagonal which is aiming towards the pawn in front of the black king, but you can't really do that right away, because if you go c4, black will trade off the bishops. Now it doesn't mean this isn't playable for white, but with less pieces on the board, even though black has these slight weaknesses, black is completely fine. So we get knight g4 from Dragnev, threatening to capture the bishop on f6. Magnus plays bishop g5, and now we get the move c4, and the diagonal is open. And here Magnus plays h5, trying to kick the knight away from g4. Here Dragnev plays the move queen to c3, going for the classic AA battery checkmate on g7, and now Magnus plays the move f6. Now one thing that's very interesting to note is that the computer really does not like Magnus's position. Pretty much from the get-go of this opening, it's very clear that Magnus has lost the opening battle. His opponent was very well prepared, and Magnus is slightly worse. So after f6, we get this move h4, very inspired pawn sacrifice by Dragnev. Computer wants just knight e3 here, but understandably Dragnev is playing the former 5-time world champion, a player who many consider to be the greatest player of all time, and he simply is feeling a little bit of the Magnus effect here, and he doesn't want to just try and be stable. Instead, he wants to go for the kill, sack material, and play like another famous former world champion, Michael Tal. So we get h4, bishop takes h4 is played. We have the move queen to h3 now, and here Magnus takes knight, we get queen takes bishop, and now Magnus grabs a second pawn with knight takes b4. Now what's amazing about this is that Magnus is up 2 pawns, but the computer evaluation has not budged one bit. White is still significantly better. So here Dragnev plays rook to e3. Now computer wants queen g4 first, but I think it more or less will transpose, because if you take, black has to go e5, and then after rook e3 we get something relatively similar. So Dragnev goes rook to e3, going for the rook left. He intends to checkmate Magnus Carlsen on the g file. So here Magnus plays e5, trying to blunt the power of the dark square bishop. Dragnev takes the pawn on g4. Magnus goes bishop c8, trying to bring the bishop to a better diagonal. Here the bishop looks like it's doing something, but this pawn on e4 is guarded. You can't ever push d5 because the 2 pawns control it. So what can you do with this bishop? Now Magnus has a second problem here, which is that even though he's up a pawn, his king is feeling a little bit naked here. You have a couple of pawns in front of the king, but no other material around the king, so Magnus wants to bring the bishop closer to try and defend his king. So we get queen h4, bishop e6, and now Dragnev goes rook g3, a very powerful move here, because if black plays a move like a5, for example, you simply hang the pawn on f6, and with it you probably will lose the game. So we get rook f8, guarding the pawn on f6. Dragnev plays bishop c1 here, another move that I really like. The computer actually thinks that bishop to e2 is close to winning, but it's very understandable why Dragnev did not play this move. I suspect he was probably worried about this very aggressive move, pawn to g5, potentially going after the queen. Now when Dragnev plays bishop c1, what this does is it stops black from ever playing g5 here, because here you can sack the bishop with bishop takes pawn, and after black takes the bishop here, there are many ways to win. Probably the cleanest is rook takes. I think queen takes also wins, but probably rook takes is cleanest, because after king f7, queen h7, you win the queen, or you create a checkmate on the board. So even though the computer thinks bishop e2 is a little bit better, bishop c1 makes a lot of sense. You stop g5, you can also go bishop h6, and Magnus is in serious trouble here, even though he's up a pawn. So Magnus plays rook to a7. Now Dragnev does go bishop e2, because g5 still is not a move due to the sacrifice. And what Dragnev wants to go for here is he wants to go bishop h5 and bishop g6. So say you get this position, for example, bishop h5 takes and bishop g6, and now you're threatening mate in 1 on h7, and after black moves the rook to say d8. Many ways for white to win. Probably the cleanest is to play rook c3, pinning the bishop. Let's just say black plays a move like queen c6, for example, and now you can go check, no retreat with the bishop because you lose the queen, and after king e7, queen g7, king e6, bishop to f5 would be checkmate. So looking very, very dangerous. Computer here has effectively decided that Magnus Carlsen is losing in this position. Now, will we see Magnus actually lose another game to a 2500 rated player, or will he be able to pull off one of his magic swindles or pull off the Magnus effect? So here Magnus goes queen d8. Dragnev now plays rook g6. Now again, it's very easy to look at the computer evaluations, computer moves, and see that there are many ways for white to win. From a human standpoint, rook g6 is a very logical move, and it's very clear to me that as far back as 4 or 5 moves. Dragnev has all his attention focused on this g5 pawn push, and he's very worried about it, which is why he goes rook g6 to stop the pawn from ever moving. The computer, however, thinks that white is winning after this move f4 here. One sample line is, let's say black trades on f4 and goes rook d7, trying to guard the pawn on d6. Now white has this fantastic move, bishop h5, same idea, to go for the checkmate threat. And when black plays g5, white can sack the rook with rook takes d6 here, and black is completely lost. If you take what looks like a free rook, white sacks the bishop on g5, and black just can't really stop mate without giving up a lot of material. One sample line: pawn takes bishop, rook takes pawn, you move the king, there's bishop f7, classic ladder checkmate. And if you sack the queen, after queen takes queen, king h7 here, white can go queen g6, king to h8, or wait, sorry, no, this is the wrong one. Wait, king h7 here, and now you go queen to e7, sorry, not queen g6, you go queen e7 check, and you pick up the rook, the bishop, and the knight potentially as well. All of black's pieces are hanging here, and it's GG on the spot. And if black goes king h8, there's queen e5 check, picking up the rook on d6 anyway. Now again, very easy for a human, very easy with a computer to see this is good. Another point to mention here is that if black were to play just a random move like rook e7, white can go f5 here, and now g5 is especially not playable because of en passant as well as the sack. And after, say, bishop c8, now rook h3 followed by queen h8 and bishop h5, and the black king will be checkmated. So Dragnev plays rook g6 instead, and now Magnus plays rook d7. Dragnev goes king to h2, and this is sort of the start where I feel like Dragnev loses a little bit of the momentum. In this position, again, this move f4 would have been very strong potentially. White can even play bishop to h6 as well, and white keeps quite a serious advantage. But when Dragnev goes king h2, this is going for a very sort of romantic, sort of slow conceptual plan of putting the rook on h1, moving the king, and checkmating with the double stack on the h-file. Now, there's nothing wrong with this plan, but it gives Magnus time to try and reset his pieces. So Magnus goes rook f7, we get rook h1, king f8, king g1 back. Now, of course, Magnus goes king e7, and he's playing a classic Bond cloud. So Magnus has the king on e7. That being said, his king is pretty safe. You've got a lot of pawns around the king. You've got the bishops, the rooks, and if Magnus has time to bring the knight back to the center of the board, he probably will be able to consolidate and win the game. So Dragnev plays queen g3 here, trying to win the pawn on g7. Magnus plays the move queen to g8, and now we get this move bishop e3, and Magnus plays rook b7, trying to guard the pawn. Now again, with the computer, very easy to see that it doesn't like rook b7. It thinks for whatever reason a5 is the best move, and I think it's because after bishop takes b6 here, black can go knight a6 and knight c5, something very, very strange, very weird, that even seeing it doesn't make sense to me. So instead, Magnus plays the logical human move to guard his extra pawn on b6, and now Dragnev plays f4, which is the best move in the position. Again, Magnus has an extra pawn here, but his king is weak. He has some weaknesses in the center, and if you're playing with white with the two Bs, you need to be very aggressive. Now, what else can white really do here? Not a whole lot other than try to open up the center. You can't really push c5. You could push a5 to sack a pawn, as we'll see later in the game, but realistically, f4 makes the most sense. There's f5, you can trade. You're trying to open up the center of the board very quickly. So Magnus decides to trade the pawns on f4, which is a very, very big mistake here. Computer says king d8 is a better move because after takes and now rook d7, guarding the pawn on d6. Here, Dragnev misses a win when he plays this move rook h5. Now again, very easy at home, just sitting here chilling to see what the computer thinks is best. But from a human standpoint, this move a5, sacrificing a pawn, is completely winning. And the reason is because black can't really guard the pawn, let's just say queen b8, because then you hang the pawn on g7. So you can't really move the queen away to guard this pawn because then you hang the pawn on g7. So what else can you do? You can't go rook b7 because bishop takes pawn will win the knight and the game. And so the only other move, which is the obvious one, is pawn takes pawn. But now white can sack a third pawn with c5, and after d takes c5 and bishop to e3, black has no good way to guard this pawn here on c5. The king is open. They're all kind of infiltrations. Both of the Bs are very active, and white is completely winning here. So actually, just to finish it off, there is one sample line I'll show you guys, which is knight to c6, bishop c5, and king 8. And here white can play the very nasty move rook gh6, stacking the rooks. If you take the rook, it's checkmate immediately. And if you don't take the rook on h6, I'm just going to go rook h8 and win your queen on g8 and the game as well. So a5 would have been winning on the spot for Dragnev, but again, a little bit low on time, probably feeling a little bit of nerves. He knows he has a really good position, and he plays the move rook h5 instead. Nothing wrong with this move. Magnus goes knight to c6 back, and now Dragnev blunders with this move, queen h4. Again, what Dragnev needed to play in this position was pawn to a5, sacking a second pawn. If black takes with the pawn here, now white can go c5, and if pawn takes, it's even better because you have rook takes c5 here, followed by a move like queen to a3, g7 is weak, and again, the two Bs are very active here, and black will lose the game. So after a5, the obvious move a computer would suggest is knight takes a5, but now white can sack a third pawn in the center with e5, and after takes, let's say black were to take on e5, you can sack the rook with rook takes e6, king takes rook, queen e5 would be a checkmate. And after king to d8, white can go queen takes e5, threatening mate on b8. There's also rook to e8, and the right triangle is simply overwhelming here. So this would have been winning, but instead Dragnev plays queen h4 here. And what his idea is, let's just say black plays a5, you have rook to h8, winning this queen on g8 because it simply has no squares available. So here Magnus plays this move rook to d8, which is surprisingly a mistake. What Magnus probably should have played was a move like queen to a8 or maybe queen c8 as well. And this way, if white ever goes rook to h8, you can simply block with the rook, and after rook h7, rook g8, black is completely solid here. You want to go knight e5 and queen c5 in the next two turns, and black probably will win the game. But Magnus instead plays rook to d8, stopping this move rook h8. Dragnev now goes queen to f2, targeting the pawn on b6. Magnus plays rook to b8, and here Dragnev finally sacrifices the pawn with a5. Unfortunately, in this situation, it's not quite as clear-cut in terms of what the obvious plans, or not obvious, in terms of what the plans are after Magnus gobbles with the knight. So after knight takes pawn, Dragnev plays this move queen d4, which is still a good move, but it sort of throws away a lot of the advantage. Queen g3 would have been a better move here because you target the pawn on d6, but you still spy the pawn on g7 as well with the double stack. And after rook to d8, white again has this thematic sacrifice with e5, and after d takes e5 and bishop takes e5, again, the computer thinks that white is completely winning here with the two Bs in the center. One sample line, let's say black goes queen f8, is you can play bishop b2, and this is very reminiscent of some of the games that were played between Stockfish and AlphaZero, where AlphaZero would sacrifice pawns, open up diagonals for the bishops, and win some very, very nice games. Now in this position, black has simply lost because you have this bishop a3 idea. If you go king d7, for example, there's still bishop to a3 hitting the queen, and after queen to e8, now white can play c5, opening the other diagonal, and with the rooks, the bishops, even the queen infiltrating, white is completely winning. Now again, not super obvious to see. That being said, considering the players have reached time control, I am a little bit surprised that Dragnev did not find it. So instead, Dragnev plays queen d4, attacking the pawn on d6, but now Magnus can go queen d8 because the pawn on g7 is no longer under attack, whereas on g3 it was. So after queen d8, we get rook h7, and this still looks very good for Dragnev because black has an issue here. How do you guard both the pawns on d6 and g7? If you go king f8, I have rook h8 winning the queen. So you can't move the king back. You also can't go queen g8 because then you hang the pawn on d6 and the game. So Magnus plays knight c6, we get queen d2, and now Magnus plays the move queen c7, which is actually the best move and gives him really serious chances to avoid losing. Again, can't guard the pawn on g7, so the next best thing to do is play queen c7, because let's not forget, at the end of the day, Magnus does have two extra pawns here in this position. So Dragnev plays rook g takes g7, and now Magnus plays rook to f8. Dragnev goes bishop h5, and it looks like the house is collapsing here for Magnus. If you were to trade the rooks on g7, after takes and bishop f7 here, white can trade the bishops and play the in-between move bishop takes pawn, checking the king and the queen. And after queen takes bishop, you take the rook with check. If king takes, you lose the queen, and if king e6, I can sack the rook on f6, win the queen on d6, and win the game. So it really does look like the house is sort of falling apart for Magnus, but true to form, Magnus finds the best move here, which is knight d8, sacking the rook on f7, and after white takes, Magnus takes with the rook, and it suddenly becomes very clear that Magnus might survive now, because even though he's down in exchange, his king is very safe. You have these two pawns that are guarded here. c4 is very weak. You have these outside pawns, and white also can't really open up diagonals. If white could, say, for example, get g4, g5 and open up a diagonal for the bishop, it would be winning, but you're very slow, and so you can't really open up the diagonals around the king. and with the c4 pawn being weak and these two outside pawns, white actually might have to be a little bit careful. So Dragnev plays bishop e3, Magnus trades the rooks, goes knight f7, and now the dust is settled, and Magnus is only a little bit worse here because the king is snug as a bug in a rug here. Two pawns, a bishop and a knight. King is doing really well, which is a perfect example of why you should play the Bond Cloud in professional chess. So after knight f7, we get queen to b4. Magnus takes the pawn on c4. Dragnev captures on b6 here. Now he could have traded the queens on c4 and effectively drawn the game, but Dragnev here figures it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He knows he must have been winning earlier. He wants to keep the game going. So Magnus takes on e4, and now we get rook to g8 being played, and it's very clear here that Magnus has survived the worst, because Magnus now has, after bishop d7, a bishop and two pawns for the rook, and his king is pretty safe. So now we start to have the question, can Magnus turn it around all the way and maybe even win this game in classic Magnus grind style? So Dragnev plays bishop f2, Magnus plays queen to d3, and here Dragnev plays rook to g3. Magnus checks, we get king h2, check, king g1, and now Magnus decides to play queen b5 rather than making a forced draw with the classic yo-yo into the right triangle. So we got queen to b5 being played here, and now Dragnev plays move queen e3. Now Dragnev could trade the queens here and probably draw the game, but in a position like this, if anybody has chances to win, it probably is black with the bishop to two pawns, and he can reroute the knight. And also it's an endgame, and against the greatest endgame player of all time, Magnus Carlsen, why would you ever want to do this? So in this position, after queen b5, Dragnev plays queen to e3 check. We get knight to e5, rook to g7 played, and now Magnus starts walking up the board with his king. Now, to be very clear, the team situation, since this is a team event, is really clear cut. Norway is losing by a point. They've drawn on boards 2 and 3, but they've lost on board 4. So Magnus, for God and country, has to try and win, and for his rating as well. So after king e6, we get queen to h3 check being played. Magnus moves the king to d5. We get this move queen to h7, an important move because it covers the check on b1 while trying to target the bishop on d7, and maybe even allows for queen g8 check as well. So Magnus plays f5 here, cutting off the diagonal, and now queen b1 is a very serious threat. But Dragnev has this move bishop to g3, trying to undermine the knight on e5 and then maybe win the bishop on d7. Magnus plays the move knight to g4, and now we get this move queen g8 check. If white were to take what looks like a free bishop after queen b1 check, king has no squares available due to the horse, and after bishop e1, queen takes, this would be checkmate, and GG, why not? So here Dragnev goes queen g8, Magnus plays bishop to e6. You got to go queen a8 because otherwise queen b1 will still be checkmate. Queen a8, king to d4, we get the move queen to a7, king to d3, and now Dragnev plays this move rook to b7. And here Magnus plays queen c5 check, and after queen takes c5, the game ends rather abruptly in a draw, but it ends in a draw for the simple reason that after queen takes queen, pawn takes, white can play rook b6, attacking the bishop and the pawn. If you play bishop c4 here, now white can go rook c6, attacking the pawn. If you could magically get the pawn set up here like this, you would be winning, but you just can't save both of the two pawns because after king d4, there's bishop to d6, attacking the pawn. If you go king d5, now white is actually winning after rook takes pawn, king takes bishop, rook takes bishop with rook a4, and capturing the pawn on a6 in the next couple of moves. So after rook b6, what black probably would play is bishop d5, and after rook takes a6, black can go c4. And after rook a3 and a move like king to e4 here, white can still play bishop e1 and try to set up with the bishop on c3, but with black having a bishop and a pawn for the rook, inevitably black would probably be able to trade off the pawns down the road, something like this, for example. And with a knight, bishop, and pawn versus a rook and a bishop, this is a theoretical draw. So after queen takes c5, the game ends in a draw. For Magnus, actually a very good result. He was under a lot of pressure, completely lost according to the computer at various points throughout the second game of the European Team Championship. So for him, it's a very close escape. I was about to say a close shave, like the classic Wallace and Gromit movie from 50 years ago. But it's a very, very close escape from Magnus. Really, really lucky to not lose today. Clearly, he's been struggling a lot. But it is still only one game. That being said, Magnus does lose some rating points, and Norway does lose the match, unfortunately. So at the end of the day, it's a draw. Not the greatest thing ever for Norway or Magnus, but it is what it is. So On that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed my recap from the second round of the European Team Chess Championship being held in Budva, Montenegro. I will continue to be doing recaps from this event as it continues forward. And last but not least, I hope all you guys have enjoyed all the great content on my channel. And if you've not subscribed already, make sure to smash that subscribe button below. And I will see you guys all very, very soon. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.